He had buried 3 marriage contracts and scared off 4 women in 2 years, not with cruelty, but with the truth of who he was. A scarred mountain man with blood on his hands and ice in his chest, living where the wind could kill you and the loneliness would finish the job. When the last letter arrived, nobody in Cold Pine believed another woman would actually come. But she did, and she was nothing like anyone expected. Neither was what happened next. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this mountain reaches. Hit like and stay with me till the end. Chapter 1. The letter arrived on a Thursday, which in Cold Pine meant it arrived whenever Heck Brower felt like riding up from the lower valley, and Heck rarely felt like doing much of anything before noon. Ronan Vane heard the horse before he saw it. He always did. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when the sound reached him, 200 yards through the spruce trees, the uneven clop of Heck's sway-backed mare on the frozen creek trail. He set the axe down in the stump and waited. Didn't call out. Didn't walk toward the sound. If someone wanted to find him on this mountain, they could do the work of finding him. Heck appeared through the tree line, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. He was bundled in 3 layers with a wool scarf pulled up over his chin, and he was already shaking his head before he'd gotten close enough to speak. "Before you say anything," Heck said, pulling a letter from inside his coat. "This ain't my idea, and I ain't responsible for whatever comes of it." Ronan looked at the envelope without taking it. "What is it?" "Letter. From the arrangement office in Cartwell." Heck held it out further. "Another one." The silence between them was the particular kind that settles around men who've known each other long enough to run out of polite things to say. Ronan took the letter. He turned it over once, studied the postmark, and tucked it into the front pocket of his work coat without opening it. "You're not going to read it?" Heck asked. "I'll read it inside." Ronan, "Thank you, Heck." Heck sat on his horse for another moment, clearly wanting to say more, clearly deciding against it. He'd known Ronan Vane for 11 years, long enough to remember when the man had been something closer to approachable. That was before the avalanche in the Kettridge Pass took 3 of Ronan's trapping partners, and left Ronan himself with the scar that ran from his left temple down through his jaw, before the isolation had calcified into something harder than loneliness, something that didn't have a clean word for it. "Widow Tanner says the winter's going to be a bad one," Heck offered, because he had to say something. "Says the elk moved down early." "I know." "You've got enough stores?" Ronan looked at him. "Right," Heck said. "Well, that's everything then." He turned the mare around and disappeared back into the tree line, the sound of hooves fading until there was nothing but wind and the distant knock of a woodpecker working somewhere in the dead timber. Ronan went back to splitting wood. He finished the row he'd started, stacked it against the east wall of the cabin where the overhang would keep it dry, and then went inside. The cabin was not what people in Cold Pine imagined when they pictured it. They pictured a dark, filthy cave of a place, which was what most people pictured when they imagined where a man like Ronan Vane would live. They were wrong about almost everything except the darkness. The cabin was built low and solid, rough-hewn timber walls 2 feet thick, a flagstone floor Ronan had laid himself over the course of a summer that had nearly broken him, a wood stove in the center of the main room that he kept burning from October through April, without exception. The shelves were organized. The tools hung on their hooks. The bed was made in the blunt, functional way of a man who makes a bed, because unmade beds are inefficient and not for any other reason. He sat at the table by the single window and opened the letter. "Mr. Vane, we acknowledge your previous correspondence and the circumstances of the prior arrangements. The office remains committed to finding you a suitable match, though we must be candid with you. The pool of women willing to relocate to the Frostjaw Mountain region has grown considerably limited. We have, however, one candidate who has expressed genuine interest after reviewing your profile. Her name is Miss Mabel Hart, age 26, currently residing in the town of Belden. She is aware of the terrain, the climate, and the nature of frontier domestic life. She has also been made aware of the specific challenges of your previous arrangements. Miss Hart is not what most would call a conventional match. We ask that you read the rest of this letter with an open mind before making your decision." Ronan set the letter down, picked up the tin mug of coffee on the table, cold now, he'd made it 2 hours ago, and drank from it anyway. Then he picked the letter back up. Miss Hart is a woman of considerable size, which has made her prospects in Belden, as she herself describes it, basically non-existent. She is direct in her speech, capable in domestic matters, and in the opinion of this office, possessed of a sturdy constitution that may in fact make her better suited than most to the demands of mountain life. She has asked us to tell you specifically that she is not afraid of hard weather or hard men. She says she's been dealing with both her whole life. We found this remark encouraging, though we leave the interpretation to you. If you wish to proceed, Miss Hart can arrive by the second week of November. We await your reply. Ronan read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on the shelf above the stove, between the almanac and the jar of compass needles he'd been collecting since he was a boy, a habit he'd never been able to explain and had stopped trying to. He stood at the window for a long time, watching snow move sideways across the ridge above the tree line. He thought about the 4 women who'd come before. He didn't let himself think about it often, but sometimes it came anyway. The memory of each departure, the way they'd looked at him in the morning light, that particular expression somewhere between pity and terror, and the sound of wagon wheels on the frozen trail going down, always going down, away from this place. Margaret Finley had lasted 9 days. She'd cited the altitude, which wasn't untrue but wasn't the whole truth either. Clara Beach had lasted 5. She'd cried the entire second day and hadn't stopped. The 2 before them he barely remembered as individuals, just shapes of women who'd looked at his cabin and his face and the vast white nothing of the mountain and made the sensible choice. He told himself it was fine. It was fine. He knew how to be alone. He'd built something real here, something that produced, something that sustained. 40 acres of the most brutal and beautiful territory in the Frostjaw Range, trapping routes that brought in good income, a root cellar that could carry him through any winter the mountains threw at him. He didn't need company. I was 37 years old and he was very good at being alone, and sometimes in the deep of February when the cold came down from the peaks like a living thing and pressed against the cabin walls. He would sit by the stove and the silence was so complete and so heavy that it felt like something he was buried under rather than something he lived inside. He wrote back that evening. 3 sentences. I will accept the arrangement. She should bring practical clothing and good boots. The trail to the cabin is not passable by large wagon. She'll need to transfer to a pack animal at Cold Pine. He did not write, I am not an easy man to be around. He did not write, I am aware that what I am offering is a hard life with a stranger in a place that tries to kill people. He did not write any of the true things, because what would be the point? She'd see them soon enough. Chapter 2. Cold Pine was not a town so much as a decision that several families had made in the same bad winter, 30 years ago, and had never quite gotten around to reversing. It sat in the lower valley where the Frostjaw Creek spread out wide and shallow over a gravel bed, and on a clear day you could see the mountain from anywhere in it, white and enormous, and fundamentally indifferent to human opinion. There were 40-some permanent residents, a trading post that doubled as a saloon and tripled as a place to conduct business that you didn't want documented, a smithy, and a church that 2 different denominations claimed and neither particularly maintained. The whole thing covered maybe 6 acres of flat ground and generated, in Ronan's view, an extraordinary amount of noise and gossip for its size. He came down in November to pick up his winter supplies and the woman. He wore his good coat, which was, to say, the one with fewer holes, and he shaved, which he hadn't done in 3 weeks. And when he looked at himself in the tin mirror afterward, he thought he looked less like a man getting ready to meet someone and more like a man who'd shaved before sitting down to a meal he didn't particularly want. The stagecoach from Cartwell came in on a Wednesday. Ronan waited at the edge of the road near the trading post, staying out of the way of the small crowd that had gathered for no other reason than the stagecoach's arrival was the most interesting thing likely to happen that week. He recognized most of the faces. He chose not to acknowledge them. They chose not to acknowledge him, which was the arrangement that suited everyone. He heard the stagecoach before he saw it. Heard it, then saw the dust it kicked up on the lower trail, then watched it come around the bend by the creek crossing, already leaning into the turn the way the Cartwell coaches always did, too fast for the state of the road. It stopped in front of the trading post. The driver climbed down. There was a moment while nothing happened, and then the door opened and a woman stepped out. She was... Ronan searched for the right word and landed on substantial. She was round and solid in a heavy gray traveling coat, her dark hair pinned up under a practical hat that had been knocked slightly sideways by the journey. She was not tall. She planted her feet on the ground after stepping down with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd spent 7 hours being rattled around inside a wooden box and wasn't entirely sure her legs still worked. Then she looked around. Her eyes swept the small crowd of watchers, moved past the trading post and the smithy, went up, all the way up, to where the mountain hung over everything, white and vast and real, in a way that tended to rearrange people's expectations. Ronan watched her face. He'd learned to watch that moment, the moment when the mountain became real. Most people flinched. Mabel Hart did not flinch. She stood and looked at it for a solid 5 seconds, and then she said quietly but clearly, "Well, that's genuinely enormous." Nobody laughed. A few people exchanged glances. She turned then, looking for whoever was supposed to meet her, and her eyes found Ronan. Or rather, Ronan stepped forward because standing at the edge of a crowd watching a woman look for you was worse than just presenting yourself and getting it over with. I was aware of how he looked. 6'2", shoulders that had been built by 20 years of heavy physical labor, the scar running down his left jaw like a fault line in rock. He saw her register all of it, the way her eyes moved over him quickly and practically, the way someone inventories a situation rather than reacts to it. "You're Ronan Vane," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She stuck out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and dry. "Mabel Hart. I've been traveling for 2 days and I need to use a facility before we go anywhere. Tell me where one is and we can do the formal part after." He pointed toward the back of the trading post. She nodded and walked away without another word. Behind him, Ronan heard someone, he thought it was Devin Walsh, who ran the smithy and had a talent for saying the thing nobody should say, make a sound that was almost a laugh. "Lord Almighty," Walsh said, not quite under his breath. "He's finally found his match. They're practically the same shape. His is just in a different direction." A few people laughed. Ronan turned and looked at Walsh with the particular quality of attention that tended to make people find somewhere else to be, and Walsh found somewhere else to be. Mabel came back with her bag over one shoulder and her hat properly straightened, and she looked at the mountain again, then at the loaded pack animal Ronan had waiting, and then at the trail that wound up through the spruce. "That's the way?" she asked. 4 miles. "How bad is the last mile?" He looked at her, recalibrating slightly. "What makes you think the last mile's the bad one?" "Because that's always where it gets bad." She adjusted the strap on her bag. "I'm not built for pretty, Mr. Vane, I know that. But I can walk 4 miles. Tell me what to expect." "Snow. Ice on the switchback about a mile up. The trail narrows after the second creek crossing." He paused. "It's not a trail that forgives you if you lose your footing." "I'll be careful." She looked at the pack animal. "I'll carry my own bag." "I didn't say you couldn't." "Some men assume." He said nothing to that. He handed her the lead rope for the pack horse and walked ahead to find them a path through the crowd, which had not fully dispersed and was watching this exchange with the barely concealed interest of people who had very little else to watch. Mabel followed. She did not look back at the town or the watchers. Whatever Cold Pine thought of her, she left it in Cold Pine. Chapter 3. The trail up was harder than he'd made it sound, which was not unusual. Ronan had lived on this mountain long enough that his calibration for difficulty had drifted considerably from other people's. The ice on the switchback was bad, the kind that looked like wet rock until you put your weight on it and discovered otherwise. He crossed it carefully, keeping one hand on the stone face beside the trail. He turned to offer his other hand without thinking about it, because that was the practical thing when someone was crossing bad ice. Mabel had one hand already pressed to the rock and was picking her way across sideways, small careful steps, her weight distributed low. She crossed without taking his hand, without needing it. He turned back around and kept walking. They didn't talk much on the climb. He pointed out the second creek crossing and the best place to ford it, the stretch where a snow load on the upper spruces could come down without warning, the particular configuration of dead timber on the north slope that he'd been meaning to clear but hadn't gotten to. She listened. She asked one question. "Does the creek flood in spring?" And he said yes. Badly, she should know where the cabin sat relative to the high water mark. She nodded and filed that away. The light was going by the time they reached the cabin. The mountains did that, compressed the afternoon, pulled the sun down early behind the ridges, moved you from day to near dark in what felt like minutes. The temperature had dropped maybe 20 degrees from what it was in the valley. He watched her see the cabin for the first time. It came into view around the last bend in the trail, the low dark shape of it against the snow. Wood smoke coming from the chimney because he'd banked the stove before leaving that morning. He'd done that automatically, without deciding to, the same way he'd shaved, some reflex toward the ordinary that he hadn't examined. Mabel stopped and looked at it for a moment. It's solid, she said. Yes. I expected something smaller. I built it to last. She looked at him with that same quick, practical assessment she'd used when she first saw him. I can see that, she said, and went in. What? The inside of the cabin did surprise her. He could tell by the slight pause when she walked through the door and looked at the arranged shelves, the clean flagstone floor, the organizational logic of a man who'd lived alone for a long time, but had lived alone deliberately. She ran her eye over the kitchen space, the cast iron stove, the hanging pots, the root vegetables stored in the hanging basket. And then she set her bag down on the floor and turned to look at the room as a whole. Whose side is the bed on? She asked. It was a direct question that he hadn't expected. He pointed to the left side, the side he slept on, which was the side closer to the stove, which he hadn't thought about until just now. I'll take the right, she said. I run warm anyway. He built up the fire in the wood stove. She unpacked her bag with methodical efficiency, and he noticed she'd brought things that surprised him. Not extra dresses or any of the decorative items the previous women had brought, but practical gear. A pair of thick wool socks still in paper wrapping, a folding knife in a leather case, a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to be dried herbs, not cooking herbs, medicine herbs, oregano and yarrow and dried elderberry, the kinds of things someone brought when they expected to be far from a doctor. You know herbals? He said. My grandmother did. I paid attention. She set them on the shelf near the window. You have any medical supplies here? Some. Bandages, carbolic, needle, and thread. Good. You got injured often? Occasionally. She gave him a look that suggested occasionally from a mountain man probably meant something different than from anyone else, and didn't press the point. I can sew a clean stitch, she said, if it comes to that. Ronan went to tend the fire and thought that this was, already, unlike anything he had experienced with the women who'd come before. What? Chapter 4. The first week was cautious on both sides. Ronan knew his own patterns well enough to recognize how he was behaving, working longer hours than necessary, staying outside past dark, giving her the cabin to herself in the evenings with the unstated understanding that this was an arrangement, not a relationship, and she could have her space and he would have his habits, and maybe that would be enough. Mabel moved into the rhythms of the cabin without complaint and without performance. She cooked, not elaborately, practically, the way someone cooks who understands that food is fuel, and fuel keeps you alive. She learned where things were without asking twice. She took over the task of checking the animal pen in the morning, which freed him to get to the trapline earlier, and she didn't make a thing of it, didn't announce it or expect acknowledgement. She just did it because it was a thing that needed doing. He told himself she was just competent. He told himself a lot of things. On the 5th day, a storm came in from the northwest. Not the worst the Frostjaw Range could manage, but serious enough. He was on the trapline when it started, 2 miles from the cabin, and he made the calculation that experienced mountain men learn to make fast, whether to push through or shelter where you are. He pushed through because he knew this trail and the storm was still building. When he got back to the cabin, wet and cold through layers that were supposed to prevent exactly that, he found Mabel had brought extra wood in from the stack before the worst of the snow hit, had laid out dry wool on the chair nearest the stove, and had a pot of something hot on the fire. She was sitting at the table with a mending project, his mending, a pair of work pants she'd apparently found with the knee gone, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Get the wet off," and went back to the mending. He stood there a moment, dripping on his own floor. "There's broth," she said, without looking up. "Don't just stand there." He changed. He drank the broth. He sat at the other end of the table and didn't say anything for a while. The storm pressed at the walls. The stove popped and settled. Mabel worked through the mending with the focused patience of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "You're not from a city," he said. "No." "Where then?" "Small farm, south of Belden, my father's." She bit off a thread. "He died 2 years ago. Farm went to my brother. My brother's wife had... We didn't get on, so..." She said it without self-pity, the way you state a weather fact. It rained. The farm wasn't mine anymore. And the arrangement office. It seemed like a practical option. She turned the pants and examined her work. People in Belden had decided what I was a long time ago. Didn't seem worth staying around to argue with them about it. He understood that more directly than he wanted to. What did they decide you were? He asked. She looked at him then, direct and steady. A woman nobody would want. She said it flatly, without flinching from it, the way you look at an old scar. Not proud of it, not destroyed by it, just acquainted with it. What did they decide you were? Dangerous, he said. Cursed. Take your pick. And are you? The dangerous part's accurate. She looked at him for another moment. I can live with accurate, she said, and went back to the mending. Chapter 5. What nobody in Cold Pine understood, what Ronan himself would have dismissed as sentimental nonsense if anyone had tried to explain it to him in advance, was that there is a particular kind of honesty that lives in close quarters. Two people in a space this small, through weather this bad, in a silence this complete, cannot maintain the usual performances. There is no audience for pretense. There is only the reality of another person, with all their strange habits and unexpected qualities, pressed up against the reality of yourself. He learned her habits the way you learn terrain, by moving through them, by finding the places that were unexpected. She talked to the horse when she thought he wasn't listening, full conversations, her voice taking on a different quality, softer and more amused, as if the animal was someone she found reliably good company. She couldn't sleep if the fire got too low. He figured this out on the second week when she got up at 2 a.m. to add wood, and he heard her through the thin dark of the cabin. She had nightmares sometimes. He could tell by her breathing, though she never mentioned them in daylight, and he didn't ask. She had a habit of working through problems out loud, talking herself through the logic of something. What to do with the kitchen stores, the best configuration for the shelves, whether the roof needed work over the east side, and then when she'd reasoned it to her conclusion, she'd stop talking and just go do the thing. He found he didn't mind this. He found, actually, that the sound of her reasoning moved through the cabin in the evenings like something he hadn't realized was missing. She learned him too, though she was quieter about it. She learned that he slept badly during the new moon, that he had a limp in cold weather, that he'd never explained and never would, that the scar on his jaw went deeper than the surface, that there were days when something had settled in him like weather, some darkness that had its own pressure system, and on those days the best thing was to let it pass without trying to fix it. On the third week, she fixed the east side of the roof. She'd mentioned it twice in her out-loud reasoning way, noted that the overhang was shedding ice in a pattern that suggested a weak seam in the boards underneath. And one morning, while he was on the trap line, she got up on the roof with the tools from the shed and did what needed doing. He came home to her on the ladder coming down, her hat sideways and pitch on her gloves, and he stood and looked at her with an expression he couldn't fully account for. You could have waited, he said. It wasn't urgent. I was awake, she said. It was there to fix. You could have fallen. She looked at him. Then she looked at the fixed seam on the roof. Then back at him. But I didn't, she said reasonably, and handed him the pitch brush to put away. Chapter 6. The first time Cold Pine really got a good look at them together was a supply run in late November, when the weather broke for 3 days and the trail was passable. He hadn't planned to bring her, he'd gone back and forth on it. She might want to come, she might want town. She'd been in the cabin for 3 weeks without anything that could honestly be called social interaction. He stood at the door that morning with his coat on and said, I'm going down for supplies. You can come if you want. She'd been ready in 10 minutes, which told him she'd been waiting to be asked. The trail down was easier than the trail up. They walked mostly in silence, not an uncomfortable one. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, the silence between them had shifted, had become a different quality of thing. Not absence of conversation, but a kind of company in itself, the sound of two people moving through the same space and being all right with it. Cold Pine had opinions about them. He felt the opinions before they arrived, some current of attention that preceded them along the main road, eyes finding them from windows and doorways. He knew how this looked, knew what they looked like together, the scarred mountain man and the fat woman who'd come to be his bride, the arrangement that everyone had already decided was a comedy. What he wasn't prepared for was Mabel's response to it, which was essentially no response. She walked into the trading post with the same steady practicality she applied to everything else, made her own selections for supplies she needed, argued briefly and effectively with Garver Rees about the price of salt. She won, which Ronan noted with some private satisfaction, and when a woman near the counter, a settler's wife named Dora Fitch, gave Mabel a look that contained a fairly comprehensive dismissal, Mabel met it with a polite and entirely blank expression and said, "Morning," and went back to her flour. Outside, loading the pack horse, he heard Walsh behind him. Mountain air must agree with her, Walsh said to someone, too loud. She's filling out nicely. Then the short, mean laugh that was Walsh's contribution to human interaction. Ronan turned. He was aware of his own size, the way his attention could function as a kind of weight. Walsh, he said. Walsh stopped laughing. You got something useful to say? Say it. Otherwise you're wasting morning. Walsh said nothing useful. Nobody ever did, when it came to it. Beside him, Mabel finished tying the load and dusted her hands on her coat. Thank you, she said quietly. But you don't need to do that. I know. I've been handling Walsh types my whole life. I know that too. She looked at him sideways. There was something in her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. The expression of someone who sees something unexpected and doesn't know yet what to make of it. Let's get back, she said. I want to get above the switchback before the temperature drops. They walked back up the mountain together, into the cold and the clean and the immense indifferent silence of the Frostjaw Range. The town fell away behind them. The mountain came up around them. His breath steamed and hers steamed, and they walked close enough that their arms almost touched on the narrow sections of trail. He didn't let himself think too far into any of that. He was not a man given to thinking too far into things, because thinking too far into things on a mountain in winter was how you ended up staring at the dark and losing the thread of sleep. And he needed the sleep. But walking back up that trail, in the cold, with the sound of her breathing steady beside him and the mountain enormous above them both, something settled in him that hadn't been settled in a very long time. He did not examine it too closely. He just let it be there. Chapter 7. December came hard, the way the Frostjaw Range intended December to be. Cold that had weight and purpose to it, winds that found every gap in clothing and every weakness in construction. The creek below the cabin froze solid. The trapline became a kind of daily negotiation between what the weather would allow and what needed doing. He taught her things because it was practical. How to read the sky for incoming weather. How to move on ice. How to find the trail when it was buried under a foot of new snow and looked like nothing but a slightly different shade of white against white. She learned fast, genuinely fast, not the learning fast of someone performing competence, but the actual absorption of someone who takes information seriously. She showed him things too, which he hadn't expected. She could calculate stores and manage ratios with a precision that impressed him. She had the mathematics of a household running through winter worked out in her head in a way he'd always done more roughly, and her way was better. She knew which of the horses was going lame and why, something he'd been watching and hadn't fully diagnosed, and she told him exactly which tendon and what needed to be done about it. How do you know that? He asked. My father bred horses, she said, before the farm was too small to bother. He taught you. He taught my brother. I watched my brother and filled in the parts he missed. She was matter-of-fact about it, her hands moving over the horse's leg with confident patience. That's how women usually learn things. We watch what we're not supposed to be included in. He thought about that for longer than he expected to. There were evenings now where they talked. Not the necessity-only exchanges of the first week, but real talking, the kind where you wander from subject to subject and don't always know where you started. She had opinions about everything, about the lumber trade coming into the mountain territories, about the way the settlement was growing in a pattern that would eventually cause conflict over water rights, about a book she'd read. She'd brought 3 books in her bag, he'd noticed, not novels but practical things, one on medicinal plants, one on basic engineering and construction, one that turned out to be a collection of maps. You brought maps, he said one evening, when the map book was open on the table between them. I like knowing where I am, she said simply. You always know that? She looked up at him. Something shifted in her face, the particular expression of someone deciding whether to say the real thing. Not always, she admitted. In Belden I didn't. I knew what I was supposed to be, where I was supposed to fit, and it wasn't anywhere that made sense. Here, she looked at the window, the dark beyond it, the shape of the mountain they couldn't see but both knew was there. I know exactly where I am, even when I can't see the landmarks. I can feel it. Understood this more perfectly than he could have said. The mountain does that, he said. Gets into your coordinates somehow. Is that why you stayed? He thought about it honestly. I stayed at first because I had nowhere else that wanted me. Then I stayed because it was mine. Now, he paused. Now I don't think I'd know how to be somewhere smaller. She nodded as if this made perfect sense because it did. Outside, the wind came down off the peaks and hit the cabin walls with a sound like something testing its strength. And the stove burned steady, and the lamplight made warm circles on the map between them. And Mabel Hart, who was nothing anyone expected and everything this place seemed to need, traced a route along the mountain's ridgeline with her finger and said, "Show me where the trap line runs." He did. He pulled the lamp closer and traced every route with his finger and told her the landmarks. The dead snag on the first ridge, the rock formation at the upper line, the creek junction where the ice was always unreliable. And she listened with her head bent over the map and asked questions that were exactly the right questions. And at some point the evening was late and the fire had settled to deep coals and neither of them had moved to end it. I didn't know what to call what was building between them. He wasn't sure he needed to call it anything yet. But it was there, real and substantial as the mountain, as the stone floor under his feet, as the sound of her breathing in the dark of the cabin when the lamp was out and the night was very cold, and he lay awake listening to the wind, not with the hollow loneliness of February anymore, but something different, something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten it had a name. The last thing that happened in November, or the last thing that mattered, for the purposes of what came later, was a stranger on the trail. Ronan found him on the switchback, a man he didn't recognize, dressed for town rather than mountain, with new boots that were already finished, and a look in his eye that Ronan had seen before on men who came to the mountain not to live, but to take inventory. The man said his name was Prentice. He was with a land survey company out of Cartwell. He was very friendly in the particular way of men who want something. "Just mapping the territory," Prentice said cheerfully, with a leather-bound notebook in his hand that he didn't seem to be doing much mapping with. "Standard procedure when the territory opens up for development consideration." "This territory isn't open," Ronan said. "Well, that's a complicated question, legally speaking." "It's not complicated," Ronan said. "It's my land. 40 acres deeded and registered. You're standing on it." Prentice smiled and wrote something in his notebook that he turned so Ronan couldn't read it. "Absolutely, Mr. Vane. Mr. Vane, this is just preliminary. Nothing to concern yourself with." He looked past Ronan's shoulder toward the upper trail, as if he was trying to see something beyond the tree line. Then he looked back and smiled again. "Beautiful country, truly extraordinary." Ronan watched him go back down the trail. He stood there until the man was out of sight, the way you watch a thing until it's fully gone and you can be sure of where it went. Then he went back to the cabin and told Mabel about the stranger. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do they want with this land?" "I don't know yet." "But you have an idea." "Copper deposits in the upper Kettridge. There have been rumors for years. If someone's confirmed them—" He stopped. The rest of it he didn't need to say. Mabel was quiet again, looking at the shelf above the stove as if she was working through the geometry of something. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality. Not alarmed, but settled in, the way someone settles in when they've decided to take a thing seriously. "We should find out what they know," she said, "and we should find out who else in the valley they've been talking to." He looked at her. "Why?" She looked back at him, steady. "Because if they want what's up here, and there's enough of it, they're going to need more than one man with a notebook." She paused. "And if they're coming, we'd better know who's going to be on which side before they arrive." He thought about the 4 women who'd left. He thought about Margaret Finley and the look on her face in the morning. He thought about 200 feet of bad ice on the switchback and a woman crossing it sideways without taking his hand because she didn't need it. "All right," he said, "we'll find out." Outside, the Frostjaw Range held its silence the way it always did. Immense, white, completely uninterested in the plans of the small human beings who lived at its feet and called themselves its owners. But somewhere in the upper Kettridge, under snow that was already 6 feet deep and getting deeper, something valuable sat in the rock and waited to cause trouble. As things of value in hard country generally do, Prentice came back. Not alone this time. He came with another man, taller, wearing a coat that cost more than most settlers earned in a month, and they came up the trail on horseback, which told Ronan 2 things immediately. They didn't know this mountain, and they weren't worried about being unwelcome. Men who knew the mountain didn't ride horses on that switchback in December. Men who were worried about their reception didn't bring a friend. Ronan was on the cabin roof checking the seam Mabel had patched. She'd done it correctly, better than he would have, but he wanted to see it under the new ice load, when he heard them coming. He stayed where he was and watched them ride into the clearing in front of the cabin, the horses picking their way unhappily through the packed snow, and Prentice looking up and finding him on the roof with an expression of mild surprise that he covered quickly with his company smile. "Mr. Vane," Prentice called up. "Good morning. I hope we're not intruding." Ronan climbed down. He didn't rush. He pulled off his work gloves and tucked them in his coat pocket and walked toward them with the unhurried pace of a man on his own ground, because that's what he was. "You are," he said, "intruding." Prentice's companion was already looking past him, his eyes moving over the cabin, the outbuildings, the upper slope where the timber thinned and the rock showed through. He had a quality of attention that Ronan recognized, the attention of someone calculating value. "This is Mr. Aldous," Prentice said. "He represents the Kettridge Land and Resource Consortium. They're looking to develop the mineral rights in the Upper Territory, and your land sits in a position that could be very advantageous for everyone involved." "My land isn't for sale," Ronan said. "We're not necessarily talking about purchase," Aldous said. He had a voice like money, smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd rarely been told no by anyone who couldn't afford to tell him no. "We're talking about access rights, transit rights, a formal agreement that would allow survey and extraction teams to cross the lower portion of your property to reach the upper ridge. You'd be compensated, of course. Quite well, in fact." The cabin door opened. Mabel came out with a tin mug of coffee that she handed to Ronan without looking at the visitors, then stood beside him with her arms crossed and her hat pulled down against the wind. Aldous looked at her with the brief assessment of a man who categorizes things quickly and moves on. Prentice's company smile held. "Ma'am," Prentice said. Mabel looked at Aldous' coat, then at his horse, the brand on its flank, which was a Cartwell livery brand, then at Prentice's notebook. "What kind of extraction?" she asked. Aldous blinked. He hadn't expected the question from her direction. "I beg your pardon?" "When you say extraction, what are you extracting? Copper, tin, silver, what?" Prentice and Aldous exchanged the briefest look, the kind that happens below the level of intention and reveals more than a careful answer would. "Copper, primarily," Aldous said. "The geological surveys suggest—" "Whose surveys?" Another beat. "The consortium's." "So you've had men up here before, Prentice." It wasn't a question. She said it the way you state an arithmetic result. Here is what the numbers add up to. "How far up did they go?" Aldous' smooth manner acquired a slight tension around the edges, the way ice does before it cracks. "I'm not certain of the specific. That ridge," Ronan said flatly, "is 400 feet above my property line. The copper deposit you're looking at isn't on my land. The only thing on my land that you need is the trail." He drank from the mug. "And you're not getting it." Aldous looked at him for a long moment, recalibrating. Ronan could see it happening, the man shifting from the approach that worked on frightened homesteaders to something more direct. "Mr. Vane, I want to be straightforward with you. The consortium has significant resources and significant interest in this territory. The access route across your land is the most practical option, but it is not the only option. There are legal mechanisms for establishing transit rights." "Yes," Ronan said. "There are. Go find a judge and use them." He handed the mug back to Mabel. "You should get down the mountain before the light goes. That switchback is dangerous in the dark." Prentice and Aldous left. They took their time leaving, which was a message of its own. "We'll go now, but we'll go on our own schedule." Ronan watched them down the trail until the spruce trees took them. Mabel was quiet for a moment. "They're going to try the legal route," she said. "Maybe. Definitely. Men like that don't threaten with something they can't use." She was looking at the tree line where they'd disappeared. "But legal takes time, and the consortium doesn't strike me as patient." "What makes you say that?" His coat was new. Not new like he bought it this season. New like he bought it for this trip. He's not from Cartwell. He came from somewhere further, somewhere that sent him specifically for this, which means whoever sent him is already invested and already committed and doesn't want to wait 2 years for a court to decide something. She turned back toward the cabin door. "We need to know who else they've approached in the valley. The trail through your land is the most practical route, but if they can get agreements from 3 or 4 smaller plots, they can string together an access route that goes around you entirely." Ronan thought about the people in the lower valley, the Hendricks family on the South Creek, old Marius, who had the 40 acres near the first crossing, the widow Tanner, who'd been mentioned on that Thursday when Heck rode up. She had land that butted up against the western edge of his property line. They'll offer money, he said. Most of those families need money. I know. She stopped at the door and looked at him over her shoulder. So we need to have a different conversation with them before the consortium does. He wasn't sure exactly when he'd started thinking of this as we. At some point in the past weeks, it had stopped being his mountain and his problem and become something shared, the way a fire becomes shared when two people sit on either side of it long enough. You know people like that, Mabel said. It wasn't quite a question. The Hendricks, Marius, Heck Brower. You've known them for years. I know of them. That's not the same thing. No, he admitted. It's not. She looked at him with that direct, patient expression that he'd come to recognize as her thinking face, when she was working something through and had arrived at the part where she needed him to catch up. Then we should fix that, she said, before they do. 3 days later, Ronan Vane walked into the Cold Pine Trading Post and sat down at a table across from Heck Brower, which was not something he had done in the 11 years they'd known each other, and the strangeness of it was apparent to both of them. Mabel was beside him. She'd insisted on coming, and she'd insisted on being the one to start the conversation, which he'd resisted and then conceded because he didn't have a better argument against it than "that's not how I do things." And she'd pointed out, reasonably, that the way he did things hadn't exactly built him a network of allies. She ordered coffee from Garver Rees without being asked if she wanted any, which seemed to startle Rees slightly, and she put both hands around the mug and looked at Heck and said, "Tell me about the consortium men who came through last week." Heck looked at Ronan. "She's asking," Ronan said. Heck looked back at Mabel, recalibrating. "They came through on a Wednesday," he said. 2 men. One of them was Prentice. He's been through twice before mapping. The other one was new. They spent about 2 hours at the trading post, talked to Garver, talked to Devin Walsh, they talked to most people who were around. What did they offer? Heck wrapped his hands around his own mug. Per crossing fee for transit rights. Per season fee if they established a formal route. Garver's land doesn't cross their path, but they talk to him anyway, which I figure means they're trying to build goodwill across the whole valley, and not just with the direct plots. Smart, Mabel said. Yeah. Heck glanced at Ronan again, then back at her. The numbers they weren't nothing. For a family like the Hendricks, who had the bad crop year and the son's medical bills, it's the kind of money that solves a real problem. I know, Mabel said. I'm not asking you to say those families shouldn't take it. I'm asking you to help us understand what we're actually dealing with before we figure out what to do about it. Heck studied her for a moment. He was 60-some years old, and he'd spent those years in the lower Frostjaw Valley watching people come and go, watching which ones the mountain kept and which ones it sent back down. And he'd developed opinions. His opinion of Mabel Hart was forming in real time, and Ronan, watching him, could see the exact moment when it settled into something respectful. What you're dealing with, Heck said slowly, is a company with more money than patience and a legal team they're not afraid to use. They've been doing this in the Kettridge lowlands for 2 years. Came in, made offers, and when offers didn't work, they started filing easement claims and contesting deed boundaries and generally making themselves so expensive to fight that most people took what was on the table just to end it. The trading post had other people in it. Ronan could feel them listening. Garver behind the counter, 2 settler men near the far wall, old Marius himself as it happened, who'd come in for tobacco and was now very still beside the tobacco shelf in the manner of a man who's trying not to be noticed while hearing everything. Mabel had noticed Marius. She looked at him directly and said, "Mr. Marius, you've got 40 acres at the first crossing." Marius turned with the slightly caught expression. "I do." "They talked to you?" "Yesterday," he admitted. "The tall man, Aldous." "What did he offer?" The trading post was quiet enough now that there was no pretense of other conversations happening. Marius set his tobacco down on the counter and came over to the table, not sitting but standing close enough that the conversation was clearly including him. 50 a season, he said, for 5 seasons guaranteed. Ronan didn't say anything. 50 a season for 5 seasons was real money, the kind that could repair a man's barn, replace his equipment, give him something to draw on when the crops were bad or the animals got sick. He understood the pull of it in his chest, even as he sat on the other side of the question. "Did he say what the route would look like?" Mabel asked. "Once they start running ore down it." Marius shrugged. "Survey teams first. Then I'd assume—" "No," she said. Ore comes down on wagons. Wagons need a road. A road needs to be maintained. Maintained by who, on whose land, at whose expense. Those are the details that won't be in the first agreement they put in front of you. And once the road is there and the wagons are running, you've got company men on your land 6 months of the year. You've got noise and disruption and whatever they do to the creek when the heavy rains come, and there's runoff from the upper workings. She paused. I'm not telling you not to take it. I'm telling you to know what you're actually agreeing to before you do. Marius looked at the table. He was quiet for a moment. They said it could be renegotiated each season. They'll say that, Heck said quietly, right up until they don't need to say it anymore. The conversation that followed lasted the better part of 2 hours. More people drifted in, some by coincidence, some less so, because word moved fast in a small settlement when something interesting was happening. By the time they left, Mabel had spoken to the Hendricks' eldest son, who'd come in for a harness repair, and a woman named Petra Saal, whose family held the northwest pasture, and Walsh, who'd come in late and stood at the edge of things with his arms crossed and his expression difficult to read. Walsh didn't say much, but he didn't leave either. Walking back to the pack horse, Ronan said, "You knew Marius would be there." "No," Mabel said, "but I hoped. People like Marius go to the trading post when they have something turning in their heads. It's the same in every small town. The store is where you go when you need to think something through near other people." "You're good at that," he said, "reading where people will be." She gave him a sideways look. "I grew up invisible. You learn to pay attention when people don't think you're watching." She pulled her coat tighter against the wind coming off the ridge. "It's a useful skill in bad situations." "Is that what this is?" She considered it honestly. "Not yet, but it's going to be." He didn't argue with that. They rode back up the mountain in the early dusk, the cold coming down fast from the peaks, and the trail narrowing to where they had to go single file, and Ronan thought about what Heck had said, making themselves so expensive to fight that most people took what was on the table, and thought about his deed and his 40 acres, and the trail the consortium needed, and the people in the valley who had their own needs and their own pressures and their own reasons for doing what made sense to them. He thought about how a thing like this gets decided not in courtrooms, but in the spaces before courtrooms, in trading posts and around kitchen tables, and in conversations on cold mornings when a man has to choose between the money that solves his immediate problem and the principle that maybe protects something he can't fully see yet. He wasn't good at those spaces. He'd spent 20 years being bad at them, which was part of why he was where he was. He looked at Mabel's back ahead of him on the trail, her solid figure on the horse, her hat against the wind. He thought he might, for the first time in a very long time, not have to be good at those spaces entirely on his own. What he hadn't told her, what he hadn't told anyone, because telling people things was not his habit, and because he wasn't fully certain of it himself, was what he'd found 3 weeks before Prentice's first visit. He'd been running the high trap line, the one that went above the tree line into the rocky scree where the marmots denned in autumn, and he'd found a place he'd passed 100 times before that looked different. A section of the rock face that the first hard freeze had split along a seam, opening up a crack, maybe 8 inches wide and 4 feet tall, and in the crack, he'd had to use his lamp, had to get down on his knees in the snow and press his face close to the opening. In the crack there was something that caught the light the wrong color. He'd chipped a sample loose and carried it back. He had enough knowledge of minerals, from 20 years working land and trapline and talking to men who worked mines, to know what he was looking at. He'd wrapped it in cloth and put it in the bottom of the chest under his spare boots, and he hadn't told anyone. And now Prentice and Aldous were on his mountain with notebooks and numbers, and the question of what was in that crack was no longer academic. He knew, sitting on his horse behind Mabel on the narrowing trail, that he was going to have to tell her. Not because she had a right to it, the law was clear on whose land this was, but because she was right that whatever came next, they were going to face it together, and going into it with information. She didn't have felt wrong in a way that wasn't about law or practicality. It felt like the wrong kind of keeping something back, like the kind of distance that was a choice rather than a habit. He wasn't sure when the difference between those two things had started to matter to him, but it did. That night, after dinner, he went to the chest under his spare boots and took out the cloth bundle and set it on the table between them. Mabel looked at it without touching it. "What is that?" "Found it up high, 3 weeks ago. Above the tree line." He unwrapped it. The sample was about the size of his fist, ordinary gray rock with a vein running through it that caught the lamplight in a specific, unmistakable way. Mabel leaned forward. She picked it up and turned it in the light, the way she'd turned a mending project to examine her work. She was quiet for a long moment. That's why they want the trail, she said finally. Yes. They know it's up there. They suspect. The ridge gives them a line on it, but they don't know where exactly, and they can't get to it without crossing my land or spending 6 months and twice the money cutting a road up the other face. She set the rock down carefully and looked at him across the table. How long have you had this? 3 weeks. You didn't tell me. No. She was quiet for a moment. The stove popped. Outside, the wind was doing what the Frostjaw wind did at night, pressing against the walls, looking for gaps, testing what held. Why are you telling me now? He didn't have a polished answer for it. He had the truth, which was rarely polished. Because you're right, that whatever comes next, we're going to be in it together, and I don't want to walk into it with you not knowing what's in the ground up there. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he had time to feel the weight of it, the quality of her attention, which was, when fully directed, something you could almost feel physically. All right, she said. All right, what? All right, I understand why you waited, and all right, I'm glad you told me now. She pulled the sample toward her again and looked at it. This changes things. How? Because they're not going to stop. She set it down. Men with real money behind them who know there's something like this, so they don't walk away when you say no. They wait. They find another angle. They get patient or they get aggressive. And from what Heck said, this consortium leans aggressive when patience doesn't work fast enough. She looked up at him. We need more than a conversation at the trading post. We need people who will actually stand with us when it gets harder than a conversation. He thought about Walsh standing at the edge of the trading post with his arms crossed. He thought about the Hendricks boy, listening with a quiet attention that was different from his usual manner. He thought about old Marius, who'd come to stand near the table without being invited. Some of them might, he said. Some of them will, she said, if they understand what they're actually deciding between. She straightened in her chair. But we need to move before the consortium makes its second round of offers, because the second round will be bigger than the first and harder to refuse. He nodded once. The sample sat between them on the table, gray and ordinary and full of trouble, the way valuable things in hard country usually were. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed and reached across and rewrapped the cloth around it, her hands careful and certain, the same way she handled everything on this mountain that needed to be handled well. They went down the mountain the next morning before full light, which meant leaving in the dark with lanterns and picking the switchback by feel as much as sight, the ice on the trail creaking under their boots. Mabel didn't complain about the hour. She'd been up before him, had coffee made and bread wrapped in cloth for the trail. And when he came out of the cabin, she was already at the horse pen checking the lame one's leg with her fingers, her breath steaming in the lantern light. How is she? He asked. Better. Another week before you put weight on her. She stood and wiped her hands on her coat. We take the bay. They got to Cold Pine before most of the settlement had properly started its day, which was what Mabel had wanted. She'd been specific about it the night before. Not the trading post. Not the public space where conversations carried and people performed for each other. She wanted kitchen tables. She wanted the conversations that happened before people had put on whatever face they wore in public. She'd thought about the order too. Widow Tanner first, because her land was the western boundary, and because she was the kind of woman whose opinion moved others. Then the Hendricks, because the eldest son had listened at the trading post in a way that suggested he was already halfway there. Marius last, because Marius she was fairly sure of, and she wanted to end on solid ground. Ronan watched her work through this logic the night before, spreading it out on the table like she'd spread out the map, and he'd thought, this is what she does. She doesn't react to things. She arranges them. Widow Tanner's house was at the edge of the settlement, a low, well-kept structure with a kitchen garden that was buried now under a foot of snow, but showed its summer ambition in the careful structure of raised beds and fence posts. The widow herself answered the door in an apron, which meant she'd been cooking, and she looked at them both with the flat, impressed expression of a woman who'd spent 50 years on a frontier and had very little patience for anything she couldn't immediately categorize. Ronan Vane, she said. Then she looked at Mabel. You're the wife. Mabel Hart, Mabel said. We came early. I apologize for that. We won't take much of your time. Tanner looked them over for another moment, then stepped back from the door. Come in then, I've got biscuits. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something with cinnamon. Tanner poured coffee without asking if they wanted it, and set the biscuits on the table and sat across from them with her hands folded and her eyes sharp. This is about the consortium men, she said, before either of them spoke. Yes, Mabel said. They came to me last week before they went up the mountain. Tanner looked at Ronan. They knew your land was the piece they needed. They were trying to build pressure from the sides before they came at you directly. What did you tell them? Ronan asked. I told them I don't make decisions at the door and I'd think about it. She unfolded her hands and picked up her coffee. I've been thinking about it. She looked at Mabel. Tell me what you know that I don't, Mabel told her. She laid it out without drama, the same way she'd laid out the logic of the approach the night before. What the consortium had done in the Kettridge lowlands. How the agreements looked generous until the road was built and the terms stopped being renegotiable. What the ore operation would mean for water and land on a practical level. She didn't mention the sample Ronan had found. That detail she'd decided to keep back, and he'd agreed, because it wasn't relevant to what she was asking Tanner to decide, and because some information, once released, couldn't be contained. Tanner listened without interrupting. When Mabel finished, Tanner sat with it for a moment. My land doesn't border the main route they'd need, Tanner said. Whatever they want from me is secondary. It's goodwill, Mabel said. And your name. In this valley, people pay attention to what you decide. Tanner snorted, not with dismissal, but with something closer to weary recognition. 50 years of outlasting everyone gives you a reputation you didn't ask for. She drank her coffee. What are you asking me to do? Nothing yet, Mabel said. I'm asking you to wait before you sign anything. And if you're willing, to let people know you're waiting. Tanner studied her. You're not from mountain country. No, south of Belden, farm. But you're staying. Mabel met her eyes directly. Yes. Tanner was quiet for another moment. Then she said, the consortium men were polite, but they talked to me like I was a problem to be managed, not a person to be spoken to. I noticed that. She stood and refilled their cups without being asked. I'll wait, and I'll let it be known that I'm waiting. Walking out of Tanner's kitchen 20 minutes later, Ronan said, she made her decision before we arrived. I know, Mabel said, but she needed to make it with someone, not just by herself. That's different. He thought about that for the rest of the morning. The Hendricks place was harder. The eldest son, Cal, was 23 and trying to run 40 acres with an injured father and a younger brother who was sick in the way that cost money every month without improving. He was a young man carrying weight that didn't fit his shoulders yet, and the consortium's offer was the clearest solution to his most immediate problems, and he knew it, and he sat at his own kitchen table and didn't try to pretend otherwise. I understand what you're saying about the road, Cal said. I do. But my father can't work the East Field anymore, and Eli's medicine comes out of somewhere, every month, and right now that somewhere is getting thin. Mabel nodded. She didn't try to talk him out of the reality of what he'd just said. How much did they offer you? 60 per season, 5 seasons guaranteed. Your land is where the route would bend, Ronan said, which means it's where the heaviest traffic runs. The wear on your fence lines alone in year 1 would cost you 20 of that 60. Cal looked at the table. I'm not saying don't solve the problem, Mabel said. I'm saying make sure you know what you're actually trading. She paused. What does your father say? Cal's jaw tightened slightly. He says the mountain doesn't owe us a living, and neither does a company from Cartwell. He says we should find our own way through it. He paused. He's not the one who has to watch the account get smaller every month. No, Mabel said. He's not. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Cal was looking at his hands, which were rough and chapped in the way of young men who'd been doing man's work since they were 14. If you signed with them and it went badly, Ronan said, you'd have 5 seasons of money, and then whatever damage the road left. That's the math. And if I don't sign, Cal said, not with anger, but with the flat honesty of someone working through arithmetic, I've got the same situation I've got now. Not exactly, Mabel said. She looked at Ronan briefly, and he gave her nothing back either way. It was her read, her call. She'd earned the right to make it. She turned back to Cal. If the consortium can't get access, they may offer better terms to people who aren't in their direct path. Or they may abandon this approach entirely and find a different route altogether. Either way, What you're deciding isn't just about your 40 acres. It's about whether they get what they need to go forward. She paused. That's more leverage than you think you have. Cal looked up. I can't make you a promise about what Ronan's land will eventually be worth, or what the valley looks like in 10 years, Mabel said. I won't do that. But I can tell you that right now your yes is worth something to them, which means your no is worth something too, and you should know that before you decide. Cal said nothing for a long moment. Then, I need to think about it. That's all I'm asking, Mabel said. They left without a firm answer, which was not what Ronan had hoped for, but which Mabel said, on the trail to Marius's place, was probably the best they could have gotten. If he'd said yes right away, we hadn't reached him at all. If he'd said no right away, it would have been for his father's reasons, not his own. He's thinking. That means it's real. Marius, as she'd predicted, was the easier conversation. Easier not because it cost him nothing, but because he'd already been working toward this conclusion on his own and just needed somewhere to land it. He said over his own coffee, in his own kitchen that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood, that he'd been in this valley for 31 years, and he'd watched 3 different companies come through with big plans and big money, and he'd watched what they left behind each time. And he was not inclined to be the man who helped them do it a 4th time. He said this plainly and without performance, and shook Ronan's hand at the door, with the formality of an older man making something official in his own mind. On the trail back to the mountain, the afternoon light already going amber and low, Mabel was quiet for longer than usual. Ronan let it be. He'd learned the difference between her silences, the working through kind and the genuinely tired kind, and the other kind that he didn't have a name for yet but recognized. This was the working through kind. Walsh, she said finally. What about him? I was at the trading post yesterday. He didn't say anything, but he didn't leave. She was watching the trail ahead. Walsh's smithy sits right on the main path between the valley floor and your land. Not his property, the road runs through the common, but he controls the bottleneck practically. If the consortium sets up a base in the valley, Walsh's business goes up. He fixes their equipment, shoes their horses, makes himself useful. He has real incentive to want them here. Ronan said nothing. He doesn't like you, Mabel said. I know. Does he have a reason? Probably. He guided the horse around a drift that had blown across the trail. There was a dispute about a fence line, maybe 6 years ago. I was right about the boundary. He knew I was right. That was the problem. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Men, she said, with the patient exasperation of someone who'd been observing the species for some time. He'll go with whoever he thinks is going to win, Ronan said, which means we need to look like we're going to win. She pulled her coat tighter as the trail rose and the temperature dropped. That's harder when I don't know how many of us there actually are. The question hung in the cold air between them. She was right, and they both knew it. They'd had 3 conversations and gotten 2 clear answers, and 1 maybe, and the consortium had money and legal machinery and a company full of men who did this for a living, and Ronan had 40 acres and a deed and a handful of valley people who were at various points of deciding what they believed. It was not an overwhelming position, but it was what they had. They were most of the way up when the trouble found them. It came in the form of 2 men on the trail who were not there by accident. Ronan saw them 50 yards ahead, standing in the middle of the path where the trees closed in on both sides. Not Prentice, not Aldous, different men, the kind of men who were hired for presence rather than conversation, wearing coats that were practical rather than expensive, and standing with the particular stillness of people who'd been told to be somewhere and wait. He put his arm out to stop Mabel's horse. She pulled up beside him. Friends of yours? She said quietly. No. The larger of the 2 men came forward a few steps. Mr. Vane, we're not here to cause trouble. We're just here to deliver a message. Deliver it from there, Ronan said. The man stopped. Mr. Aldous would like another meeting, tomorrow morning at the trading post. He says the terms have been revised and he thinks you'll find the new offer worth your time. Tell him I'll think about it. He also wanted me to let you know. The man paused, and the pause had a quality to it, a weight, that the deed survey for your property is being reviewed. There may be some irregularities in the original filing. It's probably nothing. But these things take time to sort out, and until they're resolved, certain questions about the property could complicate other matters. Ronan felt the cold in his chest that was not the weather. What kind of irregularities, he said, and his voice came out flat and level, which was how his voice came out when the thing he was actually feeling was too large and too dark to let into his tone. Like I said, probably nothing. The man's expression was professionally neutral. Mr. Aldous just wanted you to be aware, in case it affected your thinking. The two men stepped aside and walked back down a side path through the trees, gone as cleanly as they'd appeared. Ronan sat on his horse and looked at the empty trail ahead, and did not move for a moment. They're contesting the deed, Mabel said. It wasn't a question. Threatening to, it's a pressure tactic. Can they make it stick? I was honest with her. I don't know. The original filing was done 30 years ago by the man I bought from. I have the deed. I've paid taxes. But if they've got a lawyer looking for cracks... He stopped. A good lawyer can find irregularities in almost anything if they look hard enough and the judge is sympathetic. Mabel was quiet. Her horse shifted under her and she steadied it without thinking, her hands automatic. How long would a challenge take? Months. Maybe longer. He looked at her. In the meantime, I can't sell, can't use the land as collateral for anything, can't... He stopped again. It ties me up. That's the point. She nodded slowly. The Frostjaw Range loomed over them, white and enormous and entirely unconcerned. Down below, in Cold Pine, Aldous was waiting in his expensive coat for the answer that this was supposed to produce. Up above, in the rock face above the tree line, the copper sat in its vein and waited to be the reason for all of it. We need a lawyer, Mabel said. I know. Do you have money for that? Some. I have some too, she said, from my father's estate. Not much, but some. She said it matter-of-factly, without hesitation, and he felt something move in him at that. The sheer directness of it, the uncomplicated offer of what she had toward a problem they now shared. Between us, we should be able to find someone in Cartwell who can tell us how serious the threat actually is. He looked at her in the fading afternoon light. The temperature was dropping, and her nose was red with it, and her hat was sideways again from the wind, and she was sitting on a horse on the side of a mountain that was actively trying to freeze them both, and talking about pooling their limited resources to fight a company with more lawyers than either of them had dollars. And her expression was not heroic. It was tired and practical, and a little annoyed, which was the expression of someone dealing with a real problem and not performing how they felt about it. You don't have to do this, he said. It isn't what you came up here for. She gave him a look. What did I come up here for? He didn't have a clean answer to that. He'd been thinking about the answer to that question for weeks, turning it over the way he turned the compass needles in his jar, looking at it from different angles. You came up here for an arrangement, he said finally. Yes, she said, and I stayed for something else. She held his gaze for a moment, direct, unflinching, the way she faced everything on this mountain. Then she looked back at the trail. Let's get up before full dark. I don't want to do the switchback blind. He followed her up the mountain. The wind came off the high peaks and hit them in the face, and the trail was hard under the horse's feet, and the last light went orange over the ridgeline and then was gone. They did the switchback by lamplight and feel and made it to the cabin with their fingers numb and their breath heavy from the climb. Inside, while Ronan built up the fire, Mabel sat at the table and opened the map book to the page with the Frostjaw Range and looked at it without speaking. He watched her trace the ridge with her finger, the same route she'd asked him to explain weeks ago, the night that felt like a different winter now. They're going to move fast, she said. The deed challenge is the first step. They'll file papers, create uncertainty, try to get you to settle before you've had time to think. She didn't look up from the map. We need to move faster. What do you have in mind? She finally looked up. Her eyes in the lamplight were dark and steady. I want to call a meeting, not at the trading post, not in bits and pieces at kitchen tables. Everyone together. The Hendricks, Marius, Tanner, Walsh, heck, everyone who has skin in this valley, and everyone who's been approached by the consortium. She paused. I want them to see each other making this decision. People are braver together than they are separately. Walsh won't come. Walsh will come because he wants to know what everyone else is deciding. She closed the map. And when he sees where it's going, he'll decide the same way. She said it not with certainty, but with the specific confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading which way rooms leaned. Ronan looked at the fire. When? 3 days? Before Aldous makes his second offer to anyone. He nodded. Outside, the Frostjaw wind pressed against the walls and found no weakness in the timber. Ronan had set 20 years ago, when he'd built this place to outlast everything the mountain could throw at it. He hadn't known, building it, what everything would eventually include. He thought he was building against weather and loneliness and the ordinary slow erosion of isolation. He hadn't thought about men with notebooks and lawyers and money and the kind of patience that looks like friendliness right up until it doesn't need to anymore. But the walls held. They'd held 20 years of winters, and they'd hold this. He had to believe that. And sitting in the cabin with the lamp burning and Mabel's finger on the map, for the first time in a long time, believing it didn't feel like something he had to do alone. The meeting happened in the Cold Pine Church, which neither denomination had gotten around to locking properly, and which was therefore available to anyone willing to light the 2 wood stoves at the back and wait for the building to reach a temperature that didn't threaten exposed skin. Ronan and Mabel arrived an hour early and did exactly that. He split the kindling and she laid the fires with the systematic attention she brought to every task that had a right and wrong way to do it. And they worked in this kind of parallel silence that had become, over weeks, its own form of conversation. People came in ones and twos starting around 7. Marius first, stomping snow off his boots in the doorway, then Heck with his collar turned up and his expression suggesting he'd had mixed feelings about coming and had come anyway. The Hendricks showed up as a unit. The father, thin and moving carefully with his damaged back, Cal behind him, and the younger brother Eli, who was 14 and had the particular alertness of a sick child who'd learned to pay attention to adult conversations because adult conversations determined the shape of his world. Widow Tanner came alone and sat in the front row, like a woman who had no interest in the back of anything. Walsh came last. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room, doing his accounting of who was there and what it meant. And then he sat on the far side with his arms crossed and his expression set to something that could be neutral or could be hostile, depending on how the next hour went. 15 people total. More than Mabel had hoped for, fewer than Ronan had feared might show up just to watch something fall apart. She stood at the front. She hadn't prepared a speech. He knew she hadn't, because she'd gone to sleep before he had the night before, and she didn't perform things she hadn't prepared. What she'd done instead was spend 2 days thinking, which with Mabel was the same thing as preparation. "I'm going to tell you what I know," she said, without preamble. "And then I'm going to tell you what I think it means. And then anyone who wants to disagree with me should say so, because I'd rather have that conversation now than have someone decide something different after they've walked out the door." She told them about the Kettridge lowlands. She told them specifically names of the settlements, how the agreements had started, what the access roads had done to the land in year 2 and 3, which families had been in court by year 4 disputing terms that the consortium's lawyers had written to be deliberately ambiguous. She'd gotten most of this from a letter Heck had helped her send to a man he knew in the lowlands, a former trapper named Doss who'd watched the whole thing unfold from close range and had opinions about sie that he put on paper with impressive thoroughness. The room was quiet, not the polite quiet of people waiting for something to end, the actual quiet of people processing information they hadn't had before. Then she told them about the deed challenge. That landed differently. She could feel it land, the shift in the air of the room, the way several people exchanged looks, the way Cal Hendricks straightened slightly in his seat. "They're challenging his deed," Tanner said. "Threatening to file a challenge," Mabel said, "to create uncertainty, to make the cost of fighting them feel bigger than the cost of settling." Can they do that? This from Petra Saul, who'd come with her husband and was sitting near the middle with the focused expression of someone who'd already been losing sleep over this. "A lawyer can file a challenge on almost anything," Mabel said. "Whether it goes anywhere is a different question. We've written to a lawyer in Cartwell. We're waiting to hear." "In the meantime," Heck said from his seat near the wall, "the filing alone is enough to complicate things." "Yes," Mabel said. "That's the point." Walsh uncrossed his arms and recrossed them the other direction. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" he said. His voice was not aggressive, but it was careful, the voice of a man deciding how much of himself to put in the room. Mabel looked at him directly. She'd been looking at everyone directly throughout, but the look she gave Walsh had something extra in it, an acknowledgement that they both understood he was here for specific reasons, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. "Right now I'm asking you to know what's actually happening before you make a decision about it. Whatever you decide after that is yours to make." "And if we decide the consortium's money is worth taking," Walsh said, "then that's your decision." She didn't flinch from it. But you should know that if enough of the valley signs with them, Ronan loses the practical standoff regardless of what the courts eventually decide about the deed. And if Ronan loses the standoff, the road goes through, the operation starts. And what's on the table right now? Those per season numbers that sound reasonable. Those numbers stop being what they are now and start being whatever the consortium decides they are once they don't need anyone's goodwill anymore. Walsh said nothing. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind it had shifted. The particular movement of a man who's been presented with an arithmetic he hadn't fully worked through. The father, Thomas Hendricks, spoke then. He'd been sitting with his hands on his knees and his jaw set in the way of a man managing pain, and when he spoke his voice had the deliberate weight of someone who didn't use words casually. I've been on this land for 19 years, he said. I bought it because nobody else wanted it, and I wanted something nobody could take from me. He looked at his hands. I understand the money. I know what Cal's been dealing with. But there's a difference between a hard season and signing your name to something that can't be unsigned. Cal looked at his father. He looked at him the way a young man looks at an older one when he's trying to figure out if he's hearing wisdom or stubbornness. The two things wearing each other's clothes more often than not. Then he looked at Mabel. You said our yes is worth something to them. Our no too. Yes. Worth enough that they'd negotiate differently? If enough of us said no together? That's what I think, Mabel said. I can't promise it. Cal nodded once. Not the decisive nod of someone announcing a decision, the slower nod of someone settling into one. He looked at his brother Eli, who was sitting very still, following everything with those wide, attentive eyes. Something passed between the brothers that had no words in it. We're out, Cal said. Thomas Hendricks put his hand briefly on his son's arm. Not a thank you exactly. More like a steadying. The room moved after that. Not uniformly, not without friction, but it moved. Petra Saal said her family was out. Marius said he'd never been in. Tanner said she hadn't needed a meeting to decide, but she was glad the meeting had happened because this valley had spent too many years acting like a collection of separate problems instead of a place where people lived together. And if it took a company from Cartwell to remind them of that, then at least something useful had come out of it. Walsh was last. He'd been sitting through all of it, with his arms crossed and his face working through calculations that he wasn't sharing. When it got to him, the room went a different kind of quiet, the waiting kind. I'll tell you what I told Aldous when he came to my smithy, Walsh said. I told him I'd think about it. He paused. I've thought about it. He looked at Ronan, and for a moment the 6-year-old argument about a fence line was in the air between them. Not gone, not resolved, but acknowledged in the way that old grievances sometimes are, when something larger comes along and forces a recalculation of what matters. I don't sign with people who send men to stand on trails at sunset, Walsh said. That's not how business works. That's something else. He left it there. Ronan read it as, I'm not with you, but I'm not against you. And if this gets uglier, I know which side of it I'm on. From Walsh, that was more than he'd expected. The meeting broke up in the slow way of gatherings where people have actually said something real and need a moment to carry it back into their ordinary lives. People filed out into the cold, and Ronan stood at the door and said goodbye to each of them, and most of them nodded at him, and a few of them shook his hand, which was more physical acknowledgement from this community than he'd received in his previous 11 years combined. Mabel was behind him, talking to Cal Hendricks in a low voice near the back of the church. He couldn't hear the specifics, but he could see Cal's posture, the particular way young men stand when they're being told something that costs the teller something to say. Whatever she was telling him, it was real. When everyone else was gone, she came up to the front and he handed her her coat. Walsh, he said. I know. She put the coat on. It's enough. Not what I wanted, but enough. How do you know the difference? She looked at him. Because they'll file the deed challenge regardless. That's already decided. What matters now is whether we can show that the challenge doesn't change the practical situation. She buttoned the coat's top button, which she always did when she was cold in thinking. If the valley holds, the consortium can't build the route regardless of what a court eventually decides about your deed. And if they can't build the route, the challenge costs them money without benefit. And people like Aldous don't spend money without benefit for very long. And if the valley doesn't hold? One problem at a time, she said. which was not an answer but was, he'd learned, what she said when she'd already accounted for the bad outcome and didn't see the point in living inside it before it happened. They walked out into the cold pine night, cold and clear, the stars enormous over the mountain above them. The settlement was quiet. Somewhere a horse stamped in its pen. The Frostjaw Range sat above everything, present and massive and neither threatening nor offering anything. Just there, the way it was always there, the fixed fact against which everything else was measured. They were on the trail back up, an hour out of Cold Pine, when Ronan heard something behind them that wasn't the wind. He stopped, put his hand up. Mabel pulled her horse to a stop without question, and the two of them sat in the dark and listened. Footsteps. More than one set, coming fast. He turned the horse. In the darkness behind them on the trail, two shapes, then three, resolved from shadow into men. Close, too close for this to be accidental. These were not the polite messengers of a few days ago. These were different men, shorter and less patient, the kind the consortium hadn't bothered to send in the first round. Vane. The voice was rough. You need to come down to the trading post. Aldous wants a word. Not tonight, Ronan said. Not a request. Mabel was very still on her horse. He could feel her stillness the way you feel the stillness of the mountain. Not passive, not frightened, something else. The three men moved to block the trail. Ronan assessed, quickly, practically, the way 20 years of survival in unforgiving country had trained him to assess. And what he saw was that these men were big and confident in the way of men who used their size as their primary argument, and he was bigger and had better arguments. He got off his horse. Ronan, Mabel's voice low. Stay there, he said. Not with alarm, just with the calm of someone telling another person the most efficient configuration. What happened next was not a fight in any cinematic sense. It was brief and ugly and functional. The largest of the three men reached for him, which was a mistake, and Ronan hit him once. The flat efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste motion in hard country. And the man sat down hard in the snow. The second man pulled a length of something from his coat, and Ronan stepped inside it, which removed the reach advantage, and that exchange was also brief and also settled in the snow. The third man had stopped moving entirely. Ronan stood in the trail. His breathing was elevated but controlled. His right hand hurt in the way hands hurt after hitting something harder than expected, which was always, it turned out, bone was always harder than expected. The two men on the ground were making noise but were not seriously injured, which was exactly what he'd aimed for. He looked at the third man. Pick them up, he said, and tell Aldous I'll be at the trading post at 9 tomorrow morning. Tell him to bring a lawyer if he's got one, because I'll be bringing mine. The third man picked up his companions. They went back down the trail. In the quiet that followed, Mabel said, You don't have a lawyer. He doesn't know that. He got back on his horse. His hand was throbbing. Heck knows a man in Cartwell. We'll send a letter first thing tomorrow. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read in the darkness. He could make out the shape of it. Not impressed exactly. Not alarmed. Something more complicated than either. Are you all right? Hand's fine. I didn't ask about your hand. He looked at her. The stars were very bright overhead. Somewhere in the upper Kettridge, under all that snow, the copper sat in its vein and waited. Down in Cold Pine, Aldous was receiving a message he hadn't anticipated sending. In the valley, 15 people had sat in a cold church and decided something together. And that was new. And new things in hard country were either the beginning of something or the end of something, and you rarely knew which until later. I'm all right, he said. She nodded. She didn't push further because she understood, as she seemed to understand most things about him by now, that all right was not the same as fine, but that it was the honest answer, and that was enough. They rode the rest of the way up in silence. The switchback was brutal in the dark and the cold, and they did it slowly, one careful step at a time, the horses picking their way by instinct, and the two of them by the lamp and by the accumulated knowledge of a trail taken enough times to exist somewhere in the body rather than just in the mind. The cabin came into view around the last bend. He'd banked the stove before leaving, and smoke was still threading from the chimney in the cold air, which meant there was warmth waiting, which was not a small thing on a night like this. He'd barely gotten inside, and the stove built back up when there was a knock at the door. He opened it and found Heck Brower, which was unusual. Heck rarely made the mountain trail after dark, and the expression on his face when Ronan opened the door was the expression of a man carrying something he needed to put down. Heck, Ronan said, How? I followed you up, Heck said. Saw the whole thing on the trail. I needed to tell you something, and I didn't want to say it in the church. He came inside and looked at Mabel, who was at the stove with her coat still on, and then back at Ronan. About the deed. Ronan went still. What about it? Heck's face in the lamplight was tired and ashamed in the particular way of someone who's been holding something and has finally decided the holding costs more than the telling. The man you bought this land from, he said. Garrett Ness. He came to me 2 weeks before you bought it, asked me about the survey records for this plot, whether I'd seen the original paperwork. He paused. I told him I hadn't, which was true, but there'd been talk at the time about a discrepancy in the survey, where the northwest boundary sat. Nobody pushed it because nobody wanted the land badly enough. And now someone does, Mabel said, very quietly. And now someone does, Heck confirmed. He looked at Ronan with 20 years of knowing each other in his eyes. I should have told you when you bought. I'm telling you now. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the frost-jaw wind came down off the peaks like something with a purpose. How bad is the discrepancy? Ronan said. I don't know. It might be nothing. Surveys from that era were rough. But if they've got a surveyor who knows what to look for and a lawyer who knows how to argue it, he stopped. The rest of it didn't need saying. Ronan sat down at the table. He put his hands on the surface and looked at them, the one that hurt, the one that didn't, and stayed there with it for a moment. The weight of it. Not just the legal threat, but the other thing, the thing under the legal threat, which was the possibility that this land he'd built his life on was not as entirely his as he'd believed, and that the ground beneath everything he'd made here was, in some technical and terrible sense, uncertain. Mabel put her hand over his. Not with words, just her hand, warm and solid, resting on top of his on the table. He didn't move. He looked at her hand and at the fire and at Heck's face, which was still carrying its shame and its apology, and he said, All right, Heck. Thank you for telling me. Heck left 20 minutes later with a handshake that meant more than it would have a month ago, before any of this had happened. Mabel made coffee. She set the mug in front of him and sat across the table and waited. If the survey is wrong, he said, they might have legal standing. Yes, which means we need to know exactly where the boundary sits before they file. He was working it through out loud, which was something she did, but he rarely did, and he noticed this about himself. If the northwest corner is off, it might affect the access route question entirely. The route might technically not require an easement across my land at all. It might already sit in the disputed zone. Mabel looked at him sharply. Which would mean they don't need your permission. Or, he pressed on, it might mean the deposit itself is in the disputed zone, which is a different argument entirely. A better one, for us. She was quiet, her hands around her mug, her eyes moving the way they did when she was following something to its end. We need that lawyer, she said, and we need a surveyor we trust before they put theirs on the ground. First light, he said. First light, she agreed. She didn't go to sleep easily that night. He lay in the dark and listened to her breathing and could tell by its pattern that she was awake, staring at whatever the dark in a mountain cabin has to show you at 2 a.m, and he thought about the survey and the deed and the copper in the rock and the men on the trail and the 15 people in a cold church and the whole ungainly complicated weight of what they were in the middle of. I thought about how 4 women had left this cabin and this mountain and this life, and he told himself each time that he understood that this was a reasonable response to an unreasonable place, that some people were built for hard country and some weren't, and that was simply true. He thought about Mabel's hand on the table. He thought about the fact that she was still here. Outside, the mountain sat in its enormous winter silence, and somewhere in it the answers to all of this were buried under snow and rock and time, waiting to be dug up by whoever was patient enough and stubborn enough and present enough to stay. The letter from the lawyer in Cartwell arrived 6 days later, carried up by Heck, on a morning so cold the ink had partially frozen in the envelope crease and had to be warmed by the stove before it would lie flat enough to read. His name was Aldrich Fenn, and he was not what Ronan had pictured when he'd imagined a lawyer willing to take a case from a mountain man with uncertain funds and a deed that might have problems. Fenn was 60, semi-retired, and had spent 30 years watching companies from the Eastern Territories run legal machinery over frontier landowners who didn't know what they were agreeing to until it was over. His letter was 4 pages long, single-spaced, and pulled no punches. Mabel read it aloud at the table because Ronan's eyes were not good in the early morning, and he'd never admitted this to anyone, and she'd figured it out on her own and simply started reading things aloud when the light was poor without making it a thing. The deed situation was, as Fenn put it, complicated but not hopeless, which in my experience is the best condition in which to find a legal problem. The original survey from 30 years ago had used a reference marker, a particular rock formation on the northwest ridge, that had since been partially destroyed by a rock slide. Without the reference marker, the boundary had some legitimate ambiguity. The consortium's lawyers had clearly identified this. However, Fenn wrote, what they had also clearly not accounted for was something he'd found in the county records during his preliminary search, a secondary survey done 12 years after the first, when a neighboring claim was being established. That secondary survey had used different reference markers and had implicitly confirmed Ronan's boundary line in its own calculations. It was not definitive, but it was usable, and in his opinion, a judge who wasn't in someone's pocket would find it persuasive. The key question, Fenn wrote, is not whether you can win a prolonged legal fight. You probably can, eventually. The key question is whether the consortium believes you can make the fight expensive enough that the access route stops being worth the trouble. My read on companies of this type is that they are not sentimental about losing money. If you can demonstrate credibly that you will contest every filing, challenge every motion, and make this matter cost them more than the deposit is worth in the short term, they will recalculate. To that end, I will take your case. My fee is modest by Cartwell standards, and I suspect large by yours, but I propose the following arrangement. And here Mabel paused in the reading because even she, who was not given to emotional performance, seemed to need a moment. I propose to defer my full fee until the matter is resolved, provided you can send me $50 now as a demonstration of good faith. I have been doing this work for 30 years, and I am tired of watching the same thing happen to the same kinds of people. Consider the rest a donation to the cause of making it more difficult. Ronan looked at the letter for a long time after she finished reading. He sounds like a man who's angry about something, he said. He sounds like a man who's been right about something for 30 years and is tired of being right, Mabel said. She folded the letter carefully. We can get him $50. Between us. Between us, she confirmed. They sent the money with Heck the next morning, along with a letter from Ronan authorizing Fenn to begin, and with a detailed account of the secondary survey Heck dimly remembered being part of. He'd been a young man at the time, had helped carry equipment for the surveyor, and with Mabel pressing him carefully for specifics, remembered enough to give Fenn something useful to work with. Then they waited. Waiting in a mountain cabin in January is not a passive activity. The cold requires constant management, and the trapline requires constant running, and the animals require daily attention, regardless of what legal matters are unfolding in courthouses 2 days' ride away. Ronan ran his lines. Mabel ran the cabin and the horses, and developed over those weeks a habit of being on the roof with a long glass scanning the lower trail in the early afternoons, which she did without announcing it, and which he noticed without commenting on it. She was watching for Aldis's men. They both knew the next move was coming. The question was what shape it would take. It took a shape they hadn't fully anticipated. On a Wednesday in late January, Cal Hendricks came up the mountain on foot, alone, which told Ronan before Cal said a word that something had happened that Cal didn't want anyone in Cold Pine to see him coming to tell them. He was breathing hard from the climb, and his face was the face of a young man who'd been handed something he didn't know how to carry. Mabel brought him inside and gave him coffee and waited. They got to someone, Cal said. I don't know who, but they know about the meeting. They know what was said, close to exactly what was said. He looked at Ronan. They came to my father this morning with a revised offer. They knew he'd been at the meeting. They knew what he said. They quoted him. The room was quiet. Someone in that room, Mabel said. Not a question, not with anger yet. She was still in the processing stage, the place before anger where you just establish what's true. Someone in that room, Cal confirmed. He looked miserable about it. I don't know who, but the offer they brought my father, it was bigger than the first one, and they made clear they knew about the deed situation, and they said. He stopped, steadied himself. They said they didn't want trouble, but they were prepared for it if it came. Ronan's first instinct was the instinct of a man who'd spent 20 years dealing with threats by going directly toward their source, and it was a bad instinct for this situation, and he knew it. and he sat on it. He looked at Mabel instead. She was looking at the table with the focused expression of someone working something out. After a moment, she said, "Walsh." Cal's silence confirmed it better than words would have. "I was on the edge of the room," she said. "He didn't commit to anything, but he listened to everything." She wasn't saying it with bitterness, with something flatter and more tired. He decided the consortium was going to win and positioned himself accordingly. "I'll go talk to him," Ronan said. "No," Mabel said. He looked at her. "Going to Walsh right now and confronting him is exactly what they want you to do. It puts you in the position of the angry man, and Walsh gets to feel justified, and it breaks what's left of the Valley's willingness to hold together." She folded her hands on the table. "We let it go." "We let it go," Ronan repeated, and the flatness in his voice was not agreement. "We let Walsh go," she said. "We focus on what still holds." She looked at Cal. "Does your father know you came up here?" "No, but he didn't take the offer." Cal shook his head. "He said he'd think about it, which with my father means no, but he wanted time to say it right." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "Eli asked me last night why we weren't taking the money. I didn't know what to tell him." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" Cal looked at the window. "I said some things are worth more than money, and some things you can't get back once you've given them away." And he said, he almost smiled, the exhausted, almost smile of a young man who's surprised by a 14-year-old. He said, "Like land?" And I said, "Yeah, like land." He paused. He said, "Okay." Then he went back to sleep. Mabel put her hand briefly on Cal's arm. It was a small gesture, the kind that doesn't try to fix anything. "Your father's answer is enough for now. Go home. Don't let them see you unsettled." Cal left the same way he'd come, on foot back down the trail, and Ronan watched him go from the doorway and thought about what it cost a young man to choose principle over solution when the solution was real money and the principle was abstract, until it wasn't, until the thing you'd given away was gone, and you understood concretely what abstraction had actually meant. Fenn arrived in person on the 3rd day of February. Nobody had told him the trail was what it was, or if someone had, he'd underestimated it, because he arrived at the cabin on a horse that looked like it had opinions about the experience, and in a coat that was good quality but insufficiently weighted for the elevation. He was thin and white-haired and had sharp eyes behind wire spectacles, and he shook Mabel's hand before Ronan's, which Ronan observed and chose not to analyze. "I came because I want to see the ground," Fenn said, over coffee. "Before I argue about boundary lines, I want to stand on them." Ronan took him up the next morning, just the two of them, the trail hard and the cold fierce. Fenn was not a physical man, and the upper switchback slowed him considerably, but he didn't complain and he didn't ask to stop, and when they reached the section of Northwest Ridge where the reference marker had stood before the rock slide, he stood for a long time looking at the landscape with the attention of a man translating what he saw into legal language. "The secondary survey's anchor points," he said. "Where?" Ronan showed him. He'd gone back over the documents Fenn had sent, had walked the ridge 3 times in the past week with the survey map, and he knew exactly where the markers had been, and where, implicitly, the consortium's surveyor would try to argue the ambiguity was. He showed Fenn the original anchor rock, intact, undisturbed, that the 12-year-later survey had used. He showed him the line that anchor defined. He showed him where that line sat relative to the upper trail. Fenn was quiet for a long time. "This is defensible," he said finally. "The ambiguity they're counting on is real, but the secondary survey effectively resolves it if you read it honestly." He looked at Ronan. "The question is whether we get a judge who reads it honestly." "Can we make sure of that?" "I know the circuit judges in this territory reasonably well," Fenn said, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words in cold wind. "I know which ones are open to honest arguments." He paused. "I also know that the consortium has used certain judges before. If we can establish jurisdiction in front of Judge Carver and Cartwell, rather than the circuit judge they prefer, our position improves substantially." "How do we do that?" "We file first," Fenn said simply, "before they do. We file a quiet title action establishing the boundary definitively, which puts the matter in front of the court of our choosing, rather than waiting for their challenge to dictate the venue." He looked back at the ridge. "It's a race, Mr. Vane. We need to file within 2 weeks. "Then we better get back down," Ronan said. They filed on a Friday. Fenn rode back to Cartwell with the documents and filed them with Judge Carver's court the following Monday morning, 2 hours before the consortium's own legal team, apparently also intending to move, arrived at the clerk's office with their challenge. 2 hours. The margin on which large things sometimes turn. The news came back to Ronan through Heck, who had a gift for knowing things quickly that he'd never adequately explained. The consortium's lawyers had been, in Heck's description, visibly unhappy. Obese had spent an afternoon at the Cartwell courthouse trying to have the filing venue changed, and had failed. Prentice had reportedly left town entirely, which Heck interpreted as the sign of a man who could read which way things were going and preferred not to be present for them. None of this meant it was over. Fenn had been clear about that. The quiet title action would take months to fully resolve, and the consortium had the resources to make those months uncomfortable. But the filing had done something beyond its legal function. It had made the fight public and formal and harder to conduct through the ambiguous pressure of men on trails and revised offers slipped under doors. In Cold Pine, something shifted. The settlement had watched the meeting in the church, and then the days following. The news about Walsh filtering through the way news always filtered through small places, incomplete and slightly distorted, and it had waited to see which way things actually went. When the news came that Ronan had filed first, that he had a lawyer, that the filing had beaten the consortium to the venue, people who'd been waiting readjusted their assessment of the situation. Not dramatically. People in hard country don't readjust dramatically, but the readjustment happened. Devin Walsh came up the mountain in late February. Ronan saw him coming from 200 yards out and stood in the yard with his arms at his sides and watched him come. He'd decided what he was going to say, and had then decided he wasn't going to say it, that what Walsh needed to say mattered more than what he needed to hear. Walsh stopped 10 feet away. He looked bad, not physically, but in the way of someone who'd been sleeping poorly and thinking too much, which were frequently the same thing. "I talked to Aldous," he said, "after the filing. He wanted information about your property, the layout, where things were stored, where you went and when." Ronan's jaw tightened. "I didn't give it," Walsh said. "I want you to know that. I was at the meeting. I passed what I heard at the meeting because I thought—" He stopped. "I thought they were going to win, and I didn't want to be on the wrong side of it. That was my calculation, and it was a bad one, and I know it." He looked at his boots for a moment. "But when they asked me to go further than that, I said no." "That's where you drew the line," Ronan said. "Not with generosity, just the fact of it." "It's not a pretty line," Walsh said, "but it's where it is." Ronan looked at him. 11 years of complicated coexistence. A fence line argument neither of them had handled well. A man who'd made a self-interested calculation, and then, when pushed, had found the bottom of it. This was not a story about Walsh being redeemed. It was a story about Walsh being human, which was messier and more specific and also somehow more real. "There's enough on this mountain to keep you busy," Ronan said. "If you want to be useful, be useful." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the erasure of anything. But it was a door left open, which was more than Walsh had come up the mountain expecting, and both of them knew it. Walsh nodded once. "The Hendricks boy, Ma'am. Cal. He fixed my fence last week when he saw it was down. Didn't ask for anything, just did it." He looked away toward the mountain. "This valley used to be better than it's been lately." "It can be again," Ronan said. "Costs something." "Yeah," Walsh said. "I'm finding that out." The consortium withdrew its challenge in April. It came in the form of a letter to Fenn stating that the company had elected to pursue an alternative access route for its operations, and wished to conclude its interest in the Frostjaw Mountain territory. The letter was formal and bloodless, and said nothing about 2 hours in a courthouse, and nothing about a valley that had mostly held together when it needed to, and nothing about an old lawyer in a semi-retirement who'd decided he had one more fight left in him. Fenn wrote to Ronan with the news and added, in a postscript that was almost certainly not standard legal practice, "I have been doing this for 30 years. I cannot tell you it always ends this way. But it ended this way today, and I find I am not entirely tired of the work after all." Ronan read the letter at the table and put it down and sat with it for a moment. He thought about what 30 years of watching the same thing happen to the same kinds of people does to a man, and whether the right response to that kind of weariness is to stop or to keep going. And he thought Fenn had answered that question in his own way, and at his own cost, and it deserved to be recognized. "They're gone," he told Mabel. She was at the stove. She turned and looked at him, and the thing in her face was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated. the expression of someone who'd been holding a significant weight and has just been told they can set it down, but hasn't quite done it yet. How official is it? She said. Fen says it's over. She turned back to the stove. Stirred something. When she turned around again, her face had settled into something more ordinary. The creek will flood in 3 weeks, she said. The East Bank. We should reinforce it before it goes. He looked at her for a moment. That's what you're thinking about. I'm thinking about several things, she said. The creek is one I can do something about today. He'd come to understand, how she processed things that mattered. Not through the front door, not directly, but through the side door of the next practical task. She'd done it through every hard week since November. The mountain hadn't broken her, and neither had Aldous, and neither had Walsh's betrayal, and she hadn't processed any of it with ceremony. She'd processed it by checking the lame horse's leg, and fixing the roof seam, and making coffee in the dark, and being present, consistently and stubbornly, for every ordinary thing that followed every hard thing. I thought about what it meant to be that kind of person. Not the dramatic kind of brave, not the kind that announces itself, but the other kind, the kind that just keeps showing up to the next thing that needs doing, which is both harder and less visible, and in his experience, rarer. Spring came the way it came in the Frostjaw Range, which was not gently. The snow went badly. Heavy rains in March before the snowpack was ready. Ice dams in the creek that backed up and pushed the water high before breaking dramatically at 3 in the morning and sending a wall of cold water down the lower channel. They worked the East Bank for 2 days with sandbags and timber bracing and saved the root cellar by a narrow margin. And when it was over, they were both soaked and exhausted, and Mabel had a gash on her forearm from the timber work that she let Ronan clean and stitch, while she sat on the bed and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head. You didn't tell me it was that bad, he said, working on the stitches. It happened fast. Mabel. She looked at him. He looked at her, at the 3 stitches he'd just put in her arm with the needle and thread she'd brought in November, because she'd known, apparently, that she'd need them eventually. Next time, he said, tell me. She held his gaze. You were on the other side of the bank. Then shout. She looked at him for another moment. Then, all right, she said, I'll shout. It was, in the way of things between people who don't use many words, a larger agreement than it sounded like. He tied off the last stitch, and she didn't move her arm away. And they sat there in the growing spring light, with the creek running high outside, and the cabin standing solid around them as it had stood for 20 years, and something settled between them that had been working towards settling for months. He did not say I love you in any formal or dramatic way, and neither did she. What he said, in the way of things between practical people who have learned to speak in specifics rather than abstractions, was, I'm going to add a room on the east side. This winter the cabin was tight. She looked at him. She understood what this was. The east side gets more light, she said. Better for the herbs. That's what I thought. She nodded. You'll need good timber for the frame. The spruce up the north slope is better quality. I know where it is. I know you do. She looked at her arm, then at him. Thank you. For the stitches. You have done it yourself. Probably badly, she said. I'm better with other people's problems than my own. I thought, yes, so am I, and it's taken me 37 years to find someone that's also true of, and here we both are on a mountain that tried to kill us both multiple times this winter, and I am not going to ruin this moment by saying any of that out loud. So he didn't. He put the needle and thread away and went to start dinner, and she pulled her sleeve down over the bandage and came to help without being asked. And the evening was ordinary in the way that the best evenings are. Not remarkable, just continuous. Just the comfortable fact of 2 people in a kitchen who know where the other one is without looking. By June, the settlement had changed, and not only because of what hadn't happened to it. The meeting in the church in January had done something that outlasted the consortium. It had established a habit, the habit of people in the same valley acting like they were in the same valley. Marius proposed a water rights agreement for the creek that had never been formalized, and enough people showed up to the conversation that it got done. Tanner organized a collective effort on the lower trail maintenance that had been everyone's problem and nobody's responsibility for years. Cal Hendricks, who'd found something in himself through the winter that he was still figuring out, started showing up to things and being useful and gradually stopped looking like a young man carrying weight that didn't fit his shoulders. Walsh contributed to the trail maintenance, worked alongside people he'd shortchanged in January without making a thing of it either way. He didn't earn forgiveness in any ceremonial sense. He did the work. For Walsh, that was the equivalent of the same thing. Ronan came down to Cold Pine more than he had in 11 years. Not dramatically more, not enough to transform his character, but enough to be a recognizable presence at the practical events. The trail work, the water agreement meeting. Once the repair of the trading post's north wall, which had been threatening to go for 2 winters, and finally threatened seriously enough that 6 people showed up one morning with tools and did it. He stood among them with his tools and worked and did not say much, which was still true, and people had stopped reading his silence as hostility and started reading it as just how he was, which was more accurate. I was not, and never would be, an easy man. The scars still ran the length of his jaw. The limp still came in cold weather. He still had days when something settled in him like weather, and those around him learned, as Mabel had learned early, to give those days their space. I was imperfect in specific ways that didn't change. Impatient with imprecision, slower to trust than most, prone to solving problems by going directly at them in the physical sense, when the physical sense was not always what was called for, but he was there. In a way he hadn't been for years. In a way that surprised him when he noticed it, he was simply there. In the valley. In the settlement. Present in the way of someone who decided that being a part of something, even imperfectly, was worth the exposure that came with it. Mabel did not transform the settlement. That framing would have annoyed her. What she did was more like what she did to the cabin in those first weeks. She learned where things were, she figured out what needed doing, and she did it without announcing it or requiring acknowledgement. She knew every family in the valley by spring. Not socially, not in the way of someone collecting relationships. She knew them the way she knew the mountain, which was practically and specifically and without illusion. She knew who had what problem and what it would actually take to address it, and she had a talent for connecting the problem with the person who could help with it in a way that didn't make either party feel managed. She was not liked by everyone. There were people, Dora Fitch among them, who had made their assessment of Mabel Hart in November and saw no reason to revise it, who referred to her in the dismissive shorthand of people who've decided something and find facts inconvenient. This did not appear to cost Mabel much sleep, which was itself a kind of testimony to how comfortable she'd become in her own coordinates. She'd spent her life in Belden knowing exactly what people had decided about her. She'd come up the mountain anyway. There was something on the other side of that decision that looked like freedom, the hard-won, unglamorous kind that you don't get from a good outcome, but from surviving a bad process and finding out you're still standing. She still talked to the horse when she thought Ronan wasn't listening. She still ran warm and still got up at 2 in the morning to add wood to the fire. The nightmares still came sometimes, he knew by her breathing, and she still didn't mention them in daylight. She argued with him about the location of the new room's window with a stubbornness that he found unreasonable and she found obvious, and they compromised on something neither of them had originally proposed, and it was better than either of their ideas, which she pointed out and he did not dispute. One morning in July, when the Frostjaw Range was doing what it briefly does in summer, the ice retreating up to the high peaks, the lower slopes going improbably green, the light lasting until 9 at night and coming with a quality that made even the roughest terrain look like somewhere someone might want to be. Ronan came back from the trapline, which he still ran for fur and habit, in the particular solitude it offered, and found Mabel on the roof, not fixing anything, just sitting up there with her legs hanging over the edge and her hat pushed back and the long glass in her hand, looking out over the valley below and the mountain above, and the specific immense expanse of country that had been, in various ways, trying to defeat them both for 8 months. He stood below and looked up at her. "What are you doing?" "Looking," she said. "At what?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "At how far it goes." She lowered the glass. "When I was in Belden, I couldn't see past the farm. Everything was what was right in front of me, and most of what was right in front of me was someone telling me what I was." She looked out again. "You can see a long way from up here." He understood this. He'd known it about the mountain for 20 years. He hadn't known you could understand it better with someone else also looking. "Come down," he said. "I've got something for the stove." "In a minute," she said, in the tone of someone who meant it and would actually come down in a minute, not in the tone of someone who wanted to be left alone. He understood the difference by now. I went inside and put the water on and laid a fire in the stove and listened to her boots on the roof above him. The solid, deliberate steps of a woman who moves through difficult terrain with the care it deserves, and the confidence of someone who's done it enough times to trust her own footing. The cabin settled around him. The fire started. Outside, the mountain stood in its summer light, enormous and indifferent as it had always been, carrying within it the copper deposit that had started all of it, and the rock slide that had complicated the survey, and the ice on the switchback, and the storms of January, and all the other specific and unromantic difficulties of a life conducted at this altitude. He didn't think of himself as a man who'd learned something. He was too practical for that kind of reflection. But he thought about Heck's mare on the trail in November, the uneven clop on the frozen creek bed, and the letter in his coat pocket that he hadn't opened until he was inside, and the way he'd stood at the window afterward looking at snow moving sideways across the ridge, and thinking about 4 departures and a long February silence that had nothing in it but his own breathing. He thought about a woman stepping off a stagecoach and looking at the mountain without flinching. He thought that some things could not have been predicted from what they started as, and that this was not a consolation or a lesson, but just a true thing about the way life moved through time. Not smoothly, not toward anything guaranteed, but forward stubbornly. The way people in hard country move through difficult terrain, one careful step and then another, until they look back from somewhere high and realize how far they've come. The door opened. Mabel came in with cold air and the particular energy of someone who's been outside in good weather. She pulled off her hat and hung it on its hook and looked at the stove. "Smells like the rabbit went off," she said. "It did," he said. "We're having eggs." Again, "The rabbit went off." She looked at him with the expression that lived in the neighborhood of amusement without committing to it. Then she went to the shelf for the cast iron pan and started making eggs. And the evenings started the way their evenings started, with the ordinary, with the necessary, with the small domestic machinery of 2 people in a kitchen who have made a life together out of materials that nobody in their respective histories would have predicted would hold. They held, not because they were perfect, not because the mountain became kind, or the winter became short, or the consortium became honest, or the people around them became uncomplicated. None of that happened. The mountain was what it was. The winters were what they were. People were what they were, which was a mixed proposition on the best days. But they held. And in country as hard as the Frostjaw Range, in a life as exposed and unforgiving as the one lived at this elevation, holding is not a small thing. It might be the whole thing. It might be enough.